Before Lisa Weiss spoke forward, Doug Weiss and Joni Lamb believed their secrets were secure. Lisa reveals devastating truths that could permanently damage Doug and Joni's relationship in a shocking turn of events that nobody anticipated. Betrayals, affairs, and covert behind-the-scenes actions. The Christian media landscape is being completely upended by Lisa's revelations. It's more than simply drama. This last chapter has the potential to demolish their meticulously built kingdom. You can't unheard what Lisa says once you hear it, so pay attention. Doug Weiss was viewed as the ideal Christian spouse and marriage advisor for many years. He wrote books, spoke at churches, appeared on television, and advised couples on how to love and preserve their marriages. People cheered him on, believed in him, and took his advice to heart. Doug was a devoted and devout man who understood the importance of keeping your word and defending your marriage. However, his own wife, Lisa Weiss, was sitting at home feeling invisible and unloved while he was on stages teaching people how to love their wives. By itself. For more than 3 decades, Lisa had been Doug's caregiver, housekeeper, and support system as he developed his ministry. She had faith in the guy she perceived him to be and in his goal. Lisa kept the family together while Doug was traveling, hoping for brief moments of intimacy as they waited for him to return home. However, he was frequently worn out, preoccupied with the next sermon, the next journey, or the next book when he returned home. Lisa rarely had the chats she yearned for, and the affectionate looks she missed never came back. At the dinner table, she would attempt to converse with him while seated across from him. She felt like a ghost in her own house, though, because his thoughts were elsewhere. Although loneliness was a major pain, it wasn't the only thing that was difficult for Lisa. It was seeing the guy she loved hardly look her in the eyes while he told everyone to value their spouses. She felt invisible, like an afterthought in the world they had created together, while listening to him speak about connection and faithfulness. The hectic seasons never ended, and the gap between them always widened, despite Lisa's best efforts to tell herself it was merely a busy season and that things will improve after Doug completed his next major project. People would compliment Doug on his kindness and intelligence, telling Lisa how fortunate she was to have such a good husband. Knowing they only saw the perfectly manicured picture Doug presented to the world, she would smile nicely while choking back tears. They missed the evenings when she sobbed by alone, asking God to mend the things that were going wrong in her house. They were unaware of her efforts to persevere, organizing dates and writing notes, and requesting that Doug slow down so that she can be seen once more. It was more difficult for Lisa to express her suffering because Doug wasn't harsh or noisy. She gradually faded into the background while he was simply gone, preoccupied with his mission. Lisa questioned whether she was asking for too much and whether she deserved to be seen, loved, and appreciated by her husband. As she reflected on their early years, she envisioned their future together and vowed to always pick one another. However, Lisa now recognized the man who initially selected her during peaceful times at home had long since ceased seeing her, and the picture of their ideal marriage was quite different from what she was actually experiencing. "He's ruining me, us." And I replied, "No, Joni, something very bad has happened and there's been an essay and all of this." No. Then she stood up for Pete. "He has caused Pete great pain." That Pete, the one about whom Rebecca and JW wrote a lengthy letter. That Pete is a decent man, but Rebecca and JW won't let him into their house. According to her, Susie was a chronic liar, and that she had attacked her while making these charges against a kind man, a chiropractor who is now dead but has a record. I was shocked by Joni's words to me. I begged her. I saw that aspect of her and said, "Please make amends with Jonathan for yourself." That would be the hope. All I can say is that it's not at all like the Joni on TV. It's not at all like that kind individual. However, I did catch a glimpse of that individual in the video when she discussed Jonathan's running a smear campaign, and I can't understand what you're talking about. Jonathan was not running a smear campaign, as far as I could see. Jonathan was someone I had seen. For years, Lisa Weiss had been attempting to keep things together. She wanted to think that things would improve if she continued to pray, support Doug, and hold out hope. In their marriage, in their vows, and in the mission they were constructing together, she had faith. Even after Doug stopped seeing her, she continued to have faith in him. Even though he was physically in the house, he was miles away in his thoughts when he returned home and hardly gave her a glance. She initially convinced herself that it was only a season. Doug worked diligently for God, assisting other couples in preserving their unions. She told herself that God would respect her patience, that his job was important, and that it was worth the sacrifice. In the hopes that he would notice her again and they could get back in touch, she would arrange date nights and write him little notes. However, Doug was constantly worn out, preoccupied, and moving on to the next sermon or television appearance, the next book he had to write, or the next couple he had to assist. Lisa could feel the loneliness slowly settling into the corners of her heart like a fog. She would get a stab of agony in her breast whenever she saw Doug on stage fervently preaching about faithfulness and love, advising husbands to value their wives. He seemed to be preaching to everyone else, but never to her or to himself. While their own family was silently disintegrating at home, she would observe him preach about the value of family. On several evenings, Lisa would. To keep Doug from hearing, I turned on the sink and sobbed in the bathroom. She would wipe away her tears, inhale deeply, and then return outside smiling, as if nothing had happened. She didn't want to acknowledge that she was breaking within, she didn't want to damage their ministry, and she didn't want to damage his reputation. She kept reminding herself to be strong and that supporting him, even at the expense of her own needs, was her calling. However, the quiet became more intense. There were fewer moments of bonding. The things that used to make her feel loved ceased to happen. Doug would join others in prayer, provide words of wisdom, and give advice on how to approach their spouses. Lisa began to feel as though she was living with a stranger, someone who resembled her husband but no longer selected, saw, or battled for her, while she also felt invisible and unwanted. Lisa made an effort to speak. She made an effort to express to Doug how lonely she felt, how much she needed him to visit, and how much she missed him. Doug would nod, acknowledge understanding, and make a commitment to improve. However, nothing altered. He would be gone again the following day. Lisa is left behind with the echoes of unfulfilled promises as they head off to another event, meeting, and sermon. Lisa wasn't broken in any one time. It was the little things that accumulated over the years, the slow, steady trickle of carelessness. It was the silent dinners, the phone calls that cut off any conversations, and the way Doug's eyes were constantly on his notes, laptop, or phone rather than her. It was his ability to gaze at her without actually seeing her. His ability to communicate, "I love you," without expressing it. Lisa began to feel as though she was vanishing. The incessant responsibilities of supporting a guy who had long since ceased selecting her were causing her to lose herself in the shadow of Doug's purpose. She missed being the person she once was, the one who laughed unrestrainedly, felt appreciated, and felt noticed. She felt like a ghost in her own life now, circling the days and taking care of her obligations, but feeling empty on the inside. Silently, the breaking point occurred. There was no commotion or a loud altercation. When Doug arrived home on a calm evening, he hardly noticed her before diving right into his laptop. After preparing dinner and setting the table, Lisa waited for him to arrive. When he did arrive, he sat down and hardly touched the food she had prepared, his eyes still on his phone. He nodded absently as looking through his emails, ignoring her attempt to strike up a discussion. Something broke inside Lisa at that same instant. She came to the realization that she couldn't continue to live this way, to act as though nothing was wrong, and to give up herself for a man who didn't notice her, didn't pick her, and didn't stand up for her. A feeling of regret washed over her as she glanced at Doug, who was seated across the table. Sorrow for the dreams that would never come true, sorrow for the lady she lost, and sorrow for the love they had lost. Lisa cried as she went to bed that night after understanding that the marriage she had been battling for was no longer hers. Existed. The link was lost, but Doug was still there. A stranger with a familiar face was the man who had once hugged her close and whispered dreams in the dark. Lisa was aware that she was not enough to keep a marriage intact. She couldn't be the sole one attempting, the sole one struggling, or the sole one making sacrifices. Lisa awoke the following morning with a silent determination. She felt it was time to start discovering who she was again, to stop hiding her anguish, and to stop acting like she didn't feel it. She started journaling, going to counseling, and rediscovering her identity outside of being Doug's wife. It was simultaneously excruciating, horrifying, and liberating. She came to see that being Doug's silent supporter did not define her identity, nor did her value depend on his acceptance. After years of silence, Lisa's decision to stand up for herself, come out of the shadows, and regain her voice was her tipping point. It was the realization that being faithful did not entail putting up with emotional neglect, and that loving someone did not entail abandoning oneself. It was the start of her path to recovery, self-discovery, and a life in which she was cherished, loved, and seen, not just by others, but also by herself. Lisa Weiss felt as though everything had stopped when she first learned that Doug had remarried. The man she had prayed for and trusted in for more than 30 years was suddenly standing next to another woman, grinning for pictures and telling the world about their new beginning. He did more than simply move on. It was the speed at which it all occurred. Doug remarried a few months after they filed their divorce papers, and this time, he chose Joni Lamb, a familiar figure Lisa had seen at Christian gatherings and conferences for years, and someone who was a part of their community. To the general audience, it appeared to be a charming tale of two Christian leaders who, after adversity, found love. Online users congratulated them. Social media was overrun with happy pictures and hashtags about new seasons and fresh begins as church communities shared their stories about God. However, Lisa thought that every one of those pictures was a slap in the face. As Doug and Joni celebrated, Lisa continued to wake up every day to the quiet of an empty house, still struggling to come to terms with the breakup of a marriage she had worked so hard to keep intact. Doug's rapid remarriage wasn't the only difficult aspect. He had spent years preaching to people about defending their marriages, the value of patience and loyalty, and the necessity of keeping one's word even when it was difficult. Lisa had taken those comments to heart. As Doug traveled, spoke, and wrote books teaching others how to love their families, she had lived those teachings by putting aside her personal wants to support his mission. Spouses effectively. Believing they were creating something timeless together, she had stayed at home with the kids, taken care of the house, and prayed for Doug. Everything they had constructed now seemed to be a lie. How could a man who lived his entire life urging people to fight for their marriage go on so fast? How could he share happy pictures of himself and Joni online when Lisa had to pick up the pieces of her life and heart that had been shattered? It seemed like the ultimate betrayal of everything they had stood for together, not just of Lisa as his wife. Inside the ministry. Naturally, there were rumors about how fast everything happened. People who knew Lisa asked her questions that she was unable to respond to. Had Joni and Doug been communicating before to the final divorce? While Lisa continued to pray for the healing of her marriage, was there something going on behind the scenes? The timelines seemed too neat, too quick, and too obvious for Lisa to ignore, even though she didn't want to believe it. During the night, she was lying awake, reliving memories, and wondering when Doug began to prioritize Joni over his existing family. The public celebration of their remarriage only served to exacerbate the agony. As though it were a testament to God's benevolence, Doug and Joni would share their tale on television. Friends who had previously prayed with Lisa and Doug were now posting blessings over the new marriage, ignoring the suffering Lisa was going through, while Lisa was left to grieve in private. Lisa wasn't afraid this time around. She wasn't living in humiliation. Previously, church leaders who discussed covenant and loyalty were wishing Doug well without considering the wife he left behind. Now that Doug had a new life, a new partner, and a new public persona to project, Lisa felt as though the decades she had spent supporting him had been erased. While she was forced to explain to their kids why their father was establishing a new family so soon after leaving theirs, she would come across posts celebrating Doug and Joni's marriage and describing it as God's timing. It wasn't just a private betrayal. It was loud, public, and praised by many who professed to value family and religion. Lisa would browse social media. Every time I saw pictures of Doug and Joni grinning together at ministry functions late at night, it was like a kick to the belly. She thought back to the years she had spent standing next to Doug at similar gatherings, grinning for pictures, thinking they were doing God's work together. In both Doug's life and the ministry they had established together, it seemed as though Susan had been replaced. The kids also witnessed it. They had grown mature enough to see that something was amiss. Old enough to witness the happy pictures and the headlines. Old enough to experience the bewilderment and pain of seeing their father with someone else so quickly. Lisa made every effort to keep them safe and insulate them from the suffering, but it was impossible. There was no simple explanation for why the man who had once preached about family was suddenly beginning a new one, and their world had been upended. Despite Lisa's best efforts, the treachery was too much to bear. Losing Doug wasn't the only thing. It was the loss of the life she believed they were creating indefinitely. It was losing their shared dreams. She had put her confidence in the belief that God would mend what was damaged, and they had prayed. It was witnessing her life become a footnote while Doug began a new chapter that was embraced by the same group of people who had formerly celebrated their marriage. Sometimes Lisa thought she was going mad, wondering if she was being unreasonable or if it was okay for her to feel wounded. But she knew the truth in her heart. Loyalty shouldn't look like replacing your family in record time, and love shouldn't feel like abandonment. She had devoted so many years to Doug's cause because she thought their dedication and sacrifice were important. She seemed to be the only one now who thought Lisa's quick remarriage wasn't the end. Learning to let go of a man who made his own decisions, even if it meant leaving her behind, was a difficult beginning. It was the beginning of her quest to rediscover herself. To see that Doug's decisions and the way he portrayed himself to the outside world did not determine her value. There was a moment of intense sorrow, but also a turning point when Lisa saw she could no longer live in the shadow of another person's tale. Although it was painful, the public betrayal also set her free. It helped her realize that she should be appreciated and loved for who she was, not for the part she played in someone else's life. It showed her that you can still choose to recover, find peace, and embark on a future that is exclusively yours, even when the world goes on without you. Lisa Weiss found herself in a situation she never would have thought possible following Doug's quick remarriage. Silence had taken the place of the life she had spent decades creating. And queries without answers. The lady who had formerly supported a ministry, run a household, and supported her husband through all of life's highs and lows was now left to pick up the pieces of her life by alone. She felt as though every breath was weighed down with bewilderment and anguish for weeks, and she found it difficult to even get out of bed. Lisa had always believed in praying for her family, battling for her marriage, and putting her faith in God to mend the broken. She had prayed many nights for Doug to come back to her, for the spark to ignite again, for their love to be restored. She felt as though everything she held dear had failed her when the divorce was finalized and Doug moved on so swiftly. She felt invisible, abandoned, and deceived. However, during the calm times, Lisa started to understand that her narrative wasn't over yet. It was little stuff at start. She would wake up and pour herself a cup of tea while reminding herself that, despite the changes in her life, she was still here and that her life still mattered. She began keeping a notebook, letting herself release the hurt, the rage, and the bewilderment on the paper. Digest the agony she had suppressed for so long. She took one step closer to finding her voice with every word she penned. A voice that had been muffled by years of prioritizing other people. Lisa also started praying more frequently. Her prayers, however, were different this time. She no longer prayed for the return of Doug or the restoration of the past. Rather, she prayed for courage, strength, and healing so that she could face the destiny God planned for her, even if it differed from her own. Intended. After years of feeling invisible, she prayed to God to reveal her true self without Doug's assistance. For Lisa, letting go of her guilt was one of the most difficult aspects of her recovery. She had been pondering if she was too demanding, whether she should have been more understanding, or whether she was the reason Doug drifted away, and she had spent years blaming herself for the dissolution of their marriage. Lisa gradually came to realize that she could not bear the blame for decisions that were not her own. She had shown loyalty. She had made an effort and experienced intense affection. That was sufficient. Lisa started to rediscover the things that used to make her happy as she started to rediscover herself. She spent time with her kids as a purposeful and present mother, rather than as the wife keeping the family together while her husband was away. She began going for walks and began to appreciate the beauty of the surroundings, something she had previously missed because she was too busy or depressed. The sun's warmth, the birdsong, and the straightforward. Even though she was in pain, the act of moving her body served as a reminder that life was still good. In addition, Lisa took solace in her friendships, some of which had waned throughout the years she had been attempting to maintain her marriage. Once distant friends turned into pillars of support, letting her know she wasn't alone. They sat with her when she was at a loss for words, listened to her as she talked about her suffering, and joined her in celebrating her little successes as she started to recover. The process of healing took time. On some days, Lisa felt resilient, prepared to face the days when the burden of her losses would bring her back to earth. Holidays, anniversaries, and birthdays were particularly difficult for her since they brought back memories of the past and the unfulfilled ambitions. However, Lisa made the decision to keep going despite the difficult times so that she could grieve and develop at the same time. Learning to forgive was one of the most effective things Lisa did to heal. Initially, it seemed hard to forgive Doug. The betrayal was too recent, the pain too genuine, and the hurt too profound. However, Lisa realized that forgiveness required more than just absolving Doug. It was about letting go of the resentment that was holding her down. She didn't act as though what had happened was acceptable or justify his decisions. But in order to stop the anger from controlling her, she decided to let it out. Lisa felt lighter as she extended forgiveness. She no longer desired to live her life according to Doug's actions or his personal choices. She desired for her faith, fortitude, and love to be the defining characteristics of her life. Still needed to give. She began to dream once more, letting herself see a time when she would be content, joyful, and living in harmony. Realizing that her experience could benefit women who felt invisible and unheard in their own lives, Lisa also started telling others about her journey. Like she used to do, she wrote online, talked to women's groups, and had private chats with those who were struggling in silence. Her story was one of hope rather than resentment. Her message was that people were not alone, that even the most profound betrayal may lead to recovery, and their suffering did not define them. Lisa discovered during her trip that healing meant recognizing the past while making the decision to move on, not forgetting it. She discovered that it was acceptable to acknowledge the loss, feel the grief, and grieve while holding on to the hope that better times would come. She learned that her value was not dependent on her status as a wife, her ability to fund a ministry, or how other people perceived her. She was valuable because she was a lady that God had made and loved with a purpose that transcended what she had lost. Lisa's path to recovery was not one of a spectacular recovery or an unexpected triumph. It was about everyday decisions, silent strength, and the delicate process of starting over from the ashes of what had been lost. It was about discovering her own love again, finding contentment in the here and now, and having faith that the future could still be bright. Lisa now sees a stronger lady who has survived the fire when she looks in the mirror. She observes a lady who has discovered her voice, learned to stand on her own, and is no longer residing in the background of another person's narrative. She sees hope because she has decided to continue loving, believing, and moving forward despite all that tried to shatter her, not because everything is perfect. Everyone is reminded by Lisa's healing path that even when it seems like everything has fallen apart, you can get back up and go on. It's an account of bravery, trust, and the silent strength to decide to heal in any way. It takes a long time.